Those 463,000 first-week units are the cleanest lie in hip-hop right now. Not because the spreadsheet is fake, not because Drake didn't move an absurd amount of music, and not because ICEMAN didn't debut at number 1 while HABIBTI and Maid of Honor landed at number 2 and number 3. The lie is what everybody is trying to make that number mean. Because if you've been watching this rollout like it was some triumphant return to unquestioned dominance, I need you to understand that you have been watching the wrong story. The story is not Drake came back and shut everybody up. The story is Drake dumped 3 albums into a streaming economy built to reward volume, made history on paper, and still left the culture arguing about whether anybody actually believes him anymore. That is a much uglier conversation for the ICE machine than the headlines want to admit. And once you connect the triple drop, the desperate need to control the post-Kendrick narrative, the lingering UMG legal cloud, and that old 2022 LeBron-sized universal arrangement that turned this man into far more than just a rapper, you start to see why this moment feels so weird. Personal stakes, cultural stakes, system stakes, they're all stacked on top of each other. The artist needs the win. The fan base needs the myth restored. The machine needs the numbers to still function like proof. And when we get to the part where I break down why the fakest thing here is not necessarily the music, but the framing of the music, you're going to understand why this whole Drake dropped the album of the year and got his aura back line sounds less like celebration and more like crisis management in a Canada Goose jacket. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Let me set the table properly, because if you skip the context, you miss the whole point and you start doing scoreboard analysis like a casual. ICEMAN arrived on May 15th as Drake's first new solo project since For All the Dogs, except it didn't really arrive alone. It showed up with 2 surprise companions, HABIBTI and Maid of Honor, turning what should have been one album cycle into a 3-headed chart event. That matters. It matters because this was not just another Drake release. This was his first major solo statement after the Kendrick Lamar war permanently rearranged how people talk about him. This was after Not Like Us became not just a diss record, but a cultural referendum. This was after every conversation about Drake stopped being, just is he talented, and became, do people still trust the brand? And that is a much nastier question, because talent can survive criticism. Branding dies the minute the audience starts seeing the machinery. So when Drake drops 3 albums at once, breaks chart history, floods the Hot 100 with 40 debuts, and makes the industry scream records, 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 what I hear is not confidence. What I hear is urgency. What I hear is a man and a machine trying to win the argument through volume before the audience can sit still long enough to ask whether the central album, the supposed statement piece, the cold-blooded post-beef, sharpened-up ICEMAN, actually changed how the culture feels about him. And for Drake, that question is bigger than rap pride. His value is tied to streaming gravity, catalog leverage, and the perception that he remains the safest giant in the room. Universal's 2022 multifaceted arrangement reportedly covered recordings, publishing, merch, and visual media. That is not a simple artist deal. That is infrastructure. That is corporate architecture wearing braids and a puffer. So yes, the stakes are musical, because people want to know whether the songs hit. They are cultural because the entire genre has spent 2 years debating whether Kendrick exposed something permanent about Drake's relationship to authenticity. And they are financial because when you're an asset this large, a crack in public belief is not just embarrassing, it is expensive. So the question becomes very simple and very dangerous. If ICEMAN posted giant numbers, why does the conversation still feel like a defense brief instead of a victory lap? Start with the visible evidence, because the surface is already telling on itself if you look at it without Stan goggles. Evidence piece number 1 is the chart debut itself. Yes, it was monstrous. ICEMAN opened with 463,000 equivalent album units. Yes, Drake became the first artist ever to debut at numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the Billboard 200 in the same week. Yes, on the Hot 100 he placed 42 songs total, with 40 debuts, which NPR correctly described as a giant chart event with a lot of historical asterisks attached, because streaming era volume changes what these records even mean. And that's the first crack right there. Everybody screamed historic, but a lot fewer people wanted to dwell on the mechanism. Dumping 3 albums at once into a system that rewards sheer quantity is not the same thing as one album generating undeniable cultural gravity. Does everybody understand how important that distinction is? One is market domination. The other is emotional domination. Drake got the first one. The second one is exactly what the argument is about. Evidence piece number 2 is what happened immediately after the fireworks. ICEMAN stayed at number 1 in week 2, which Drake fans will absolutely run into your mentions with like it's an ironclad victory stamp. And to be fair, 225,000 equivalent units in a second week is still huge. I'm not here to insult arithmetic, but look at the shape of it. A 52% drop for ICEMAN. HABIBTI sliding from number 2 to number 7. Maid of Honor dropping from number 3 to number 8. That does not mean the album flopped. Let's be adults. It means the triple drop event was front-loaded exactly the way a streaming saturated event is designed to be front-loaded. The first headline was an explosion. The second week told you what was actually sticky. And what was sticky was one album keeping the throne while the side projects lost altitude fast. Again, not a collapse, but definitely not the kind of everything changed forever footprint that the comeback narrative needed. The Ice Machine won the opening ceremony. The deeper question is whether he changed anybody's heart after the confetti got swept up. Evidence piece number 3 is even nastier because it's about the exact thing this rollout needed most: clean, uncomplicated momentum. Spotify initially helped pump the narrative by saying Make Them Cry had set a 2026 single-day song record, then later corrected that and said streams from 2 different album tracks had been manually combined during review. Spotify apologized, clarified that Drake still held the 2026 single-day artist and album records, but the correction matters. Why? Because a comeback this sensitive cannot afford fuzzy accounting moments. If your entire public story is see, the people have spoken, any public revision, any awkward clarification, any actually, let us clean that up moment becomes gasoline for every skeptic in the room. And this is why I keep saying the fakest part of this album cycle is not necessarily the songs themselves. It's the way every metric gets weaponized like a courtroom exhibit before the culture has even finished listening. Evidence piece number 4 is the critic split, because if this were a true consensus comeback, you would not see the response spread this wide. Pitchfork basically treated ICEMAN as another buffet of humiliation, self-pity, and conspiracy-minded grievance, saying Drake keeps circling the same fame and betrayal obsessions and won't leave the streaming complaint alone. Variety, on the other hand, called it a dexterous if bloated vindication and said it was among his most honest and nimble projects in years, even while criticizing the repetitive pacing and lack of self-editing. Complex looked at the immediate public reaction and said the consensus was mixed, with fans debating whether he sounded energized and focused or simply stuck in old beefs and old resentments. Now stop and think about that. This is supposed to be the case closed moment. Instead, the actual visible landscape is giant numbers, corrected record language, a respectable but front-loaded week 2 profile, and a review ecosystem arguing over whether this is late career revival or better package stagnation. That is not coronation energy. That is litigation by playlist. And I think we need to set the record straight on what is actually happening here. Because some of y'all have been trained to think that if the numbers are big enough, every other question becomes hating. No. A gigantic first week can prove reach. It cannot prove trust. A 3-album flood can prove appetite. It cannot prove intimacy. And when an artist's entire brand used to rest on making mass success feel effortless, even a win can feel weird if the audience can hear the effort grinding behind it. That is where we are. The triple drop king did not come back looking invisible and inevitable. He came back looking like somebody who desperately needed the culture to understand the assignment the way he understood the assignment. Those are not the same thing. Bigger evidence coming. Stay with me. And oh, do I have more for you? Because the visible stuff is honestly the easy part. The obvious stuff is what everybody can screenshot. The deeper embarrassment is in the reaction ecosystem around this album. Who rushed to defend it, who kept it nuanced, who treated it like homework, and who made it painfully clear that Drake's audience is now split between listeners who want to hear songs and loyalists who need to hear redemption. The stands are really not going to like this one, because the next layer is where you see the difference between a project being consumed and a project being argued over as a reputation management exercise. And when we get into the way YouTube reviewers, rap roundtables, and even the weird side glances from outside hip-hop treated this release, you're going to understand why ICEMAN may have won the chart cycle while still losing the clean, effortless belief that used to make Drake Drake. And yes, I'm also going to get to the business side after that, the streaming era inflation, the universal architecture, the asset not artist problem. But first we need to sit in the culture for a second, because that's where the blood pressure is telling the truth. Now, to the cultural evidence, because this is where the temperature gets uncomfortable for the freezer section. The first clue is right there in the content ecosystem that sprang up around the album. When review spaces light up after a big release, you can usually tell the mood just by the titles and the framing. And with ICEMAN, what did we get? We got Going Live with Drake ICEMAN reaction. Is Drake redeemed? We got another roundtable video literally titled Drake ICEMAN doesn't need a lot of listens to be understood. We got yet another one with Drake ICEMAN streams are dipping rapidly in the headline. Read those titles slowly. That is not the language of a scene witnessing a clean masterpiece landing with universal force. That is the language of arbitration. Redeemed? Doesn't need a lot of listens? Streams dipping rapidly? Those are defensive, debate-heavy, argument-loaded frames. The culture did not receive this like a classic. It received it like a case file. Even the pro-Drake side kept sounding like they were cross-examining the room. The second cultural clue is the size and traction of the negative review economy around this project. Anthony Fantano's ICEMAN review on the needle drop pulled huge attention fast, with the review crossing hundreds of thousands of views in about a month. Again, that does not mean his opinion is the truth. But it does tell you something crucial. People were not only rushing to hear the album, they were rushing to hear it debated, challenged, and interrogated. In healthier Drake eras, the discourse around him often revolved around catchiness, lines, memes, summer energy, and whether a song was inescapable. Here, a giant lane of the conversation was, okay, but does this really fix anything? That is a very different cultural position. It means the music is carrying the weight of a character trial. And once an artist's releases are no longer just releases, but referendums, every song has to do two jobs at once: entertain and rehabilitate. That's hard for anybody. It is especially hard for a superstar whose biggest gift used to be making all this look frictionless. Third clue, even outside core hip-hop circles, the album generated moments that felt less like domination and more like awkward cultural static. Billboard noted that BTSV posted an Instagram Stories clip where he and J-Hope reacted in real time to Drake name-dropping BTS on Make Them Cry, with both of them freezing and looking at the camera in surprise. That's a tiny moment, but culturally it matters because it captures what this era of Drake often produces. Not necessarily communal awe, but a strange mixture of amusement, confusion, and did he really just say that? Do you see the pattern? The ice machine can still force attention. Absolutely. But forced attention and welcomed energy are not the same. One gets you clips. The other gets you cultural warmth. There's a difference between a room leaning in and a room raising an eyebrow. Fourth clue is the split in professional and semi-professional reaction that Complex captured almost immediately. Some listeners were impressed by the lyrical fire and the sheer amount of material, while others thought Drake sounded stuck in the past, still orbiting old feuds and old grievances. That split is devastating in a very specific way. If a whole mission of ICEMAN was to reset the emotional weather around Drake, then a reaction field defined by better than recent work on one side and still talking in circles on the other side is not a full reset. It's partial damage control. And let me be fair here, because nuance matters and basic fan propaganda is boring. There is a legitimate counter-argument. Some people really do hear ICEMAN as focused rap Drake returning after years of bloat. Variety clearly leaned that way more than Pitchfork did. Some fans genuinely think the project restored bite, discipline, and directness. I'm not dismissing that. What I'm saying is this: if the comeback were truly undeniable, the nature of the defense would sound different. It would sound joyful. It would sound relaxed. It would sound like celebration. Instead, it sounds like people repeatedly explaining why you should accept that the comeback happened. And when defenders start sounding like PR interns with AUX chords, I start asking harder questions. Fifth clue, and this is where the shadow gets longer, is what happened by contrast with Kendrick Lamar. Because the hero in this story doesn't even need to drop on the same day to haunt the room. After the Super Bowl halftime show, Kendrick's GNX returned to #1 on the Billboard 200, and Complex reported that his 2025 halftime performance generated more than 810 million impressions and 3.65 billion global views, with 133.5 million viewers in the US. You want to know why that contrast hurts? Because one artist looks like he can spike the culture with one precision event and then let the aftershocks do the work. The other looks like he needs an avalanche of content to manufacture the same feeling of inevitability. One artist turns one stage into a seismic afterlife. The other turns 3 albums into a debate symposium. One man drops pressure. The other drops inventory. Can we have the real conversation now? And that's the cultural gear shift right there. Because if you've made it this far in the video, you can already feel that this is no longer just about did Drake make a good album? That question is too small. The real question is why, in spite of giant numbers and non-stop exposure, the room still feels unconvinced. And once you ask that question, you are no longer doing music review. You are doing system analysis. You are asking what kind of industry creates a reality where commercial volume can be overwhelming while emotional consensus remains shaky. You are asking whether we are watching an artist or a package. Hard pivot. Let's go there. Because here's the part the basic reaction channels never explain properly. The streaming era chart system and the superstar contract system are now so entangled that you can't read a release like ICEMAN as just album plus reception. You have to read it as product design inside an incentive structure. System angle number one is pure mechanics. NPR practically handed us the blueprint when it explained why Drake's history-making week came with asterisks. In a pre-streaming era, these all-time records simply did not function the same way. Catalog eligibility changed. Streaming became part of the chart formula. Releasing 3 albums on one day became a way to maximize chart occupancy in a system that rewards saturation. That does not make the success fake in the literal sense. It makes it structurally inflated as a signifier. In other words, the number is real, but the story the number gets used to tell can still be false. If I throw 3 nets into the same pond and catch more fish than the guy using 1 spear, that doesn't prove I'm a better hunter. It proves I understand the pond. Drake understands the pond better than almost anybody alive. That is not artistry alone. That is industrial fluency. System angle number 2 is asset logic. Variety's reporting on Drake's Universal arrangement back in 2022 described a sweeping, multifaceted package spanning recordings, publishing, merchandise, and visual media, with insiders calling it LeBron-sized and estimating that the overall economics could land around $400 million or more. Now, why does that matter for ICEMAN? Because once an artist occupies that kind of financial and corporate footprint, every release stops being only expressive and starts being fiduciary. The artist is still a person, yes. The songs are still songs, yes. But the function expands. A major release becomes maintenance of enterprise value. It becomes proof of life for a premium global brand. It becomes leverage in negotiations, leverage in perception, leverage in streaming platform relationships, leverage in editorial power, leverage in the marketplace of belief. And if you think that doesn't affect how a rollout is engineered, I have some OVO-branded snow boots to sell you in July. System angle number 3 is the metric crisis, the messiest and most poisonous layer of all. We are now in an era where the public has been trained to both worship numbers and distrust them at the exact same time. That contradiction eats at everybody. But it eats at Drake especially hard because his brand has been built on industrial dominance for so long. Pitchfork reported on a class action lawsuit accusing Spotify of failing to act against bot farm streams, with Drake's data cited as evidence of broader, alleged artificial streaming issues. Crucially, the report also stated that Drake himself was not accused of wrongdoing in that case. Spotify was the defendant. I want to be precise about that because precision matters. But even without accusing Drake of anything, the mere existence of a lawsuit that uses his streaming footprint as an example feeds the exact kind of skepticism that a chart-heavy comeback cannot survive cleanly. Combine that with Drake's own public fight over alleged boosting around Not Like Us, and you get a nightmare optic cycle. Every side talking about manipulated numbers, every fan base convinced the other side is juicing outcomes, and every new record immediately treated like disputed evidence instead of shared cultural experience. That is catastrophic for an artist whose magic once depended on effortless ubiquity. Now, let's connect those 3 layers. Streaming era mechanics reward volume. Corporate asset logic rewards proof of dominance. Metric distrust poisons the meaning of dominance itself. Put those together, and what do you get? You get an environment where a superstar can drop 3 albums, absorb the top of the charts, and still leave the audience with a weird aftertaste. Because the audience is not stupid. The audience may not speak in trade language, but it feels when something is being positioned at them versus when it is organically sweeping them away. And that is the deepest problem with ICEMAN. Not that it's bad. Not that it's unsellable. Not that Drake suddenly forgot how melody or flow work. The problem is that the release exists inside so much visible architecture that every success arrives pre-contaminated by suspicion. Listen, I just have to say this. When the room starts analyzing the scaffolding more than the building has a problem. And this is where the fake title really locks in for me. The album can contain real bars, real emotions, real grievances, real technical ability, and still function as a fake event if the event is built to manufacture a feeling that the actual cultural response does not naturally support. That is what I think happened here. The rollout kept saying inevitability. The discourse kept saying complexity. The charts kept saying dominance. The vibe kept saying, please accept this as restoration. One person makes music that can still fill a release calendar. The other makes moments that reset a whole room. That contrast is brutal, but it's the whole movie. So here's the truth bomb. And if you have been riding with me this far, you already know exactly where I'm going. Drake did not lose everything in the literal, accountant, Forbes list sense. Let's be serious. The man is still gigantic. He can still chart. He can still move units. He can still flood the ecosystem on command. What he lost, and what ICEMAN exposed more clearly than any speech or lawsuit or think piece ever could, is the old automatic conversion rate between numbers and belief. That is the loss. That is the real disaster. The fakest album in hip-hop history is not fake because no one listened. It is fake because the release was asked to do an emotional job that the market data could imitate but not complete. It was asked to restore innocence to a brand that no longer feels innocent. It was asked to make gigantism feel intimate. It was asked to turn record-breaking volume into trust. And no streaming platform on earth can do that for you. Let that breathe for a second. Because that is a vicious place for a superstar to end up. Not finished. Not broke. Not musically incapable. Worse. Questioned at scale. That's the place where every win creates a new argument instead of a new consensus. That's the place where even your biggest numbers get greeted with yeah. But that's the place where the audience can still admire the mechanics while emotionally stepping back from the mythology. And mythology is everything for a rapper at that altitude. You can survive bad reviews. You can survive a weak single. You can survive trend fatigue. But once the culture no longer experiences your success as self-evidently meaningful, you are in a different phase of your career, whether your fans accept it or not. You become dependent on event design. You become dependent on framing. You become dependent on rolling out proof instead of radiating it. The ice machine still works. That's the scary part. It still works. It just doesn't feel magical anymore. And the reason I'm so confident in that read is because every layer of evidence points to the same conclusion. The chart layer says huge but contextualized. The second week layer says sturdy but front-loaded. The record correction layer says careful, not clean. The critical layer says mixed, not triumphant. The review ecosystem says argued, not embraced. The Kendrick contrast says one artist still generates aftershocks with precision while the other now relies on abundance. The business layer says this is not just a rap release, but a major corporate stress test. So no, I'm not calling ICEMAN fake because there is no talent in it. That would be lazy. I'm calling it fake because it's the clearest example of an album cycle where the presentation of victory mattered more than proving that the culture had actually returned to unconditional belief. It is the most polished version yet of Drake the product trying to stand in for Drake the phenomenon. And that gap between product and phenomenon is where the aura leaked out. Meanwhile, the right person is still winning. And that part is important because I don't want to leave this story sitting in cynicism. Kendrick Lamar's position in all of this matters because he represents the opposite strategy. Not volume for volume's sake. Not saturation as argument. Not if I hit you with enough songs and enough headlines, you will eventually confuse that with destiny. Kendrick's last major run showed the power of precision, timing, and scarcity. His Super Bowl performance translated directly into giant cultural aftershocks, and GNX went back to #1 afterward. That matters. It matters because it reminds everybody that the long game in hip-hop is still what it has always been. The artist who can turn one moment into a deeper myth beats the artist who has to keep proving he can still create moments on demand. One man needed 3 simultaneous albums to dominate the chart week. The other turned one stage into months of reverberation. That's not a diss. That's a lesson. And I've been saying this for a long time. The guy who does every job to 100% always wins the long war. Not the guy who can throw the biggest weekend. Not the guy who can trigger the loudest frenzy. The guy whose work still means the same thing after the headlines cool down. Drake still has reach. He still has catalog. He still has resources. But ICEMAN showed the limits of industrial reach when the emotional relationship between artist and audience is no longer uncomplicated. Kendrick, whether you love every single move or not, still benefits from the opposite condition. When he appears, people treat it like an event because scarcity and discipline have preserved the meaning of his appearances. That is why the hero resolution here is not Drake is over. It's the culture still knows how to tell the difference between scale and gravity. One person can own more shelf space. The other can own more silence. And silence, when it's earned, is priceless. What I want everybody to understand is that this should actually make you feel better about hip-hop, not worse. Because if the biggest machine in the room can still break records and yet fail to force total emotional surrender, that means the audience is not gone. The audience is still there. The audience still has standards. The audience can still separate "I heard it" from "I believe it." That is healthy. That means art has not fully lost to distribution. It means numbers still matter, but not enough to erase doubt by themselves. And in a genre that has always cared about authenticity, voice, timing, and conviction, that is a very good sign. The culture bent toward spectacle, yes, but it did not fully surrender to it. Justice doesn't always look like your least favorite rapper going broke. Sometimes justice looks like the scoreboard working and still not being enough to settle the argument. This is only the start too, and that's the part a lot of people are missing. Because the next phase of this story is not did Drake sell. We already know he sold. The next phase is whether these three projects have real legs beyond the launch event memory. Whether the broader summer conversation produces an actual signature ICEMAN song that lives outside fan maintenance, and whether the business speculation around what this triple drop means for his long-term positioning with the universal ecosystem gets louder or quieter from here. Watch the third and fourth week cultural footprint. Watch whether the debate cools into acceptance or hardens into good numbers, unclear meaning. Watch whether Drake's next public move feels relaxed or still strangely argumentative. And watch how Kendrick's shadow continues to hang over all of it without him even needing to stand in the same room. So if you made it to this point, you already know why I'm saying this album lost everything that mattered most while still keeping everything most people can count. It lost the illusion of inevitability. It lost the old easy conversion of size into consensus. It lost the luxury of just being heard without also being interpreted as strategy. And if you want the next video, I'm going even deeper on the other side of this equation. The exact reason Kendrick Lamar's biggest move was not the diss, not even the Super Bowl, but the discipline of knowing when not to flood the market, and how that restraint quietly led him buy back cultural authority while everybody else was trying to rent it by the weekend. That one is going to hit hard, because the shock is not what Kendrick said. It's what Drake's machine accidentally proved about him by reacting the way it did. Pull up for that.